Hello, everyone that's joining us tonight. Mark Canella, UVM Extension, and we are going to wait around for about a minute or two and see if we get a few more people in through the lobby, and then we'll start. All right, looks like we're ready to go. Again, Mark Canella here, University of Vermont Extension. Glad to have you. Glad to have you join us for another one of our ACER webinar series. So tonight's topic, binding contracts and legal agreements. I'll let you know, to be honest, this is new territory for me. This is something I feel is important to discuss, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the topics that I've gotten into in my research, and also hoping for a good conversation. So definitely encouraging folks to ask questions as we go, and we're going to have, I think, quite a bit of time for Q&A. A little bit of housekeeping here. If you're new to Teams, know that there is a chat bucket, chat bubble up in the top ribbon. It's going to look like a little cartoon bubble. Keep that open if you can, because I think we'll have questions coming in, and definitely encourage you all to type some things in. Also going to trial live polling today and see if we can get that feature to work with our webinar software. Another bit of housekeeping too, we do have closed captioning that's occurring right now. So if you look in that chat window, you'll see a caption link, which you can actually see typing out real time, which is always pretty amazing. So if that helps you read a little bit, go for it. And that's there in the chat window. I think what we'll do is always, I'll present for a period of time. People will be muted. Ask questions. Mark Iselhart, our UVM Maple specialist, is also here tonight, and he will chime in and read some questions out of the chat window when I take some breaks. And then at a certain period, we'll just unlock people's microphone for general Q&A. So tonight's presentation, really, my goal is to give and provide some background on these forms of legal agreements, specifically the concept of binding contracts. I'm not a licensed attorney. I'm not a legal professional, so this will be general and really going to come from the lens of me as a business educator, as a business advisor, looking at some of the different features of these different agreements. And specifically, we're going to look at generalizations for what we think a good SAP, sale and purchase agreement, could look like. This is a direction we think our industry is headed as the industry grows. And so we'll kind of dive in, and it's going to be fair game for some thoughts and some questions as well. Many of you have been to our website, www.maplemanager.org. I want to give you a heads up that we are working with legal professionals on the SAP purchase and sale agreement. We're also working with them for a boilerplate template on a syrup purchase and sales agreement. So those agreements aren't ready yet. We had hoped to have them available to share tonight, but they should be forthcoming in the next couple months. And then back to the Q&A, I'd like to really encourage you all that if you do have questions or considerations, the spoiler is my last slide basically is, what could go wrong with these agreements between business parties. So if you do have questions, anything you chime in with tonight is actually going to help us quite a bit as we build out a small team of producers and lawyers to draft these boilerplates and make them available. But as always, maplemanager.org, we've got a couple other resources. We've got business planning tools. We do have an Ask the Team. If you got questions, you can submit things right online there. I mentioned the legal resources. We did Sugar House lease and Sugar Bush lease templates over a year ago. And our forestry team is also building out more forestry resources in the next couple months. So definitely check that out. Looking ahead to the webinars coming up. Today's the 29th, binding contracts and legal agreements. We've got 2 more scheduled so far. It's possible we may see a couple more sessions come in for November. But on October 13th, we've got Dr. Anthony D'Amato from University of Vermont that's going to give a presentation on maple forests and carbon, which really should be fascinating. And then later in the month, on Wednesday, October 27th, I'll be back with attorney Jess Phelps here in Vermont, and we're going to have a presentation on Northeast forest land tax programs, specifically looking at some of the tax abatement programs in Vermont, New York, Maine, and possibly New Hampshire, to provide an overview definitely for people that are considering getting into sugaring or considering getting into forest land ownership at a scale where the taxes are going to be something that's on their mind. A few more resources we always want to make sure people get to check out: www.mapleresearch.org, a growing archive of current and historical literature that's hit everything from industry publications to more technical or academic journals. Highly encourage you to check that out. University of Vermont Proctor Maple YouTube channel has a growing number of videos. I encourage you to check that out. And then, as always, UVM Extension Maple Program at Large, Mark Iselhart is on tonight, and he does a great job, and he's been updating everything from new video links and new statistics. I think especially as we approach the conference season here, we'll start to see more offerings for sessions that are coming up. So contracts in everyday life, let's get going. I think it's fair to start and say that this session is to get us thinking about formal legal agreements, but it's not to say that we're trying to encourage you all to get things in writing and signed by a lawyer. However, though, I guess, as I said earlier, I think as the industry grows, we recognize that there's going to be the opportunity for more players. There's certainly the opportunity for more, I don't say more risk. There's certainly an opportunity for more specialization for people to decide, hey, I want to produce sap, and hey, I want to process syrup. And we think as the community grows, there's going to be people that are going to evaluate their risk and their consequences and say, we need to have a little bit more protection. So really this session today isn't so much about just the legal, the contract, but also the concept of a business to business relationship, and very straightforward. What are the things that we look for in those relationships, and what's the attention we can put on those relationships as they form to make sure that both parties are really taken care of in an equitable way. So with contracts, honestly, we're less concerned about the ones that get fulfilled, and contracts, and especially business or purchase contracts, do get fulfilled on a daily basis, and they're never written down, but we buy things, we transact things regularly, and often it works out. But the ones we're concerned about, the ones where we want to put our attention on, is the agreements that could create major consequences if they're not completed and if they're not fulfilled. So really, I hate to be worst case scenario, but this is risk management. So we have to kind of have that thought process of what could go wrong, and then let's think about if there's ways we do feel like we want to or need to be protected. So with that, I'm gonna stop here. This is gonna be our first try for a little live polling with the Microsoft Teams format. I'm gonna give it a shot here. I'm gonna open up a poll, and I think you're gonna see it on your screen or in your chat window. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, well, that'll be a disappointment. If you get a chance, and if you see it, first question is, how well do you know this topic? Binding contracts, legal agreements. Do you feel like extremely well, just a little, or not at all? And you should be able to click a button and submit it. And I can see it in the chat window, but we've only got 3 responses, so let's let it go for a second. Well, I'm going to X out, and I don't know if it's going to terminate the poll. So if you've got an answer and you want to get it in, you got about 2 seconds to go here. All right, hopefully you got in there. And I can see it, 14%. We've probably got 1 or 2 people that really know things really well. And well, you can help with the Q&A, because I put myself in the just a little category here, and we've got a few people that don't think they know much about it at all. So that's a good start. And since it worked, I'm going to try one more here. Next question, how much do you need to understand contracts? Are any of you looking for formal business agreements now? Maybe you're just learning for learning's sake, and maybe you'll need it in the future, and maybe you just don't know. So let's give another chance there at the poll and see what we get for our group. All right. And Mark, if I could just pick on you, is that showing up okay? And you see that in the chat window, the results?
Yeah, it looks good, Mark.
Okay, good. So it worked. Well, thanks everyone for playing along there. And it's always helpful to know as we do these programs, we are always trying to consider when to give people their mics and their videos. And this live polling is this feature that we'd like to use more in classes. And well, it's nice to know when the IT works. So how much do you need to understand contracts? Well, quite a bit of you. Quite a bit of you are ready to do something now, and people are thinking about it. So that is great. Let's hopefully share some information and share your situations if you're comfortable when we get to Q&A. So reasons to prepare a contract. Well, is it possible? Could it be possible that someone could fail to remember the agreed upon terms if it was a handshake or a verbal agreement? Could be totally unintentional, but let's be honest, if there's some sort of duress, some sort of unfortunate condition, and someone doesn't remember the terms, that could be problematic, and certainly could raise a concern for the business relationship. Balancing risk appropriately between buyer and seller parties. This is something we do all the time with business planning. I do it all the time with transfer and succession planning, especially when there's a senior business owner or a parent and a younger generation, a son or a daughter that's getting involved in the business. People are trying to understand if someone's got more risk on them and if we can have a relationship that smooths this out. So there's certainly a reason there to prepare a contract if there's a reason that one person feels like they've got more of the risk or potentially someone's got more of the power and don't feel that that's comfortable. Last reason here, a short list of reasons to prepare a contract, is the basics of the legal terms that I will be probably ill prepared to explain too much tonight, but the very important legal terms that would identify the remedies if the contract is broken, breached, or unfulfilled. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to like the consequences, but the agreement in advance of this is how we're going to deal with it, whether it's a penalty or it's whether we say this is going to be the process, the moderation or the mediation process to handle the resolution. Those are things that can be discussed in advance. So when something goes wrong, we've got a format. And I can say this from working with some business conflicts between partnerships and family LLCs that do have operating agreements set up. There is a lot of boilerplate in a legal operating agreement that says this is how we deal with problems. And when those situations get tense and people are feeling hurt or threatened, boy, it's really nice to have something to lean back on and say, oh, this is the boilerplate, this is the process, this is the list of things we're going to go through. Let's go back to that general relationship, whether it's a handshake or whether it's a written format that you're going to pursue. What's the general due diligence as you're building business relationships? And these are just a few. You might have some more of your own here, but familiarity between the buyer and the seller. Everyone wants to be aware of who they're dealing with. Some of the big things to look for financially, revenue problems or credit problems. Is there any reason to think that the person or the business that you're engaging with in this agreement could have issues? On the buyer side, we certainly want to know if the buyer is going to have revenue in hand to make payments. Credit is certainly relevant, especially for a syrup processor that is going to have a lot of upfront costs before the syrup is sold. Are they going to need advance credit to pay their suppliers for everything from glass jugs and in this situation tonight, the concept of maybe buying sap in advance. And that goes both ways as well. For the processor may be concerned, does the supplier in fact have the capacity to get this product to them as planned and as needed? And reliability in general, asking around and understanding if people tend to do what they say they're going to do and how they conduct themselves, hopefully in a professional manner. Some general due diligence there. And then just this conversation or this thought about leverage, identifying who has the power. Power could come in different ways, certainly from a business format. I'd say, honestly, having financing, having capital, or having wealth is definitely one source of power. It insulates a person or a party from the risks or the fallout. Another prospect for leverage here is options. And as we work through the scenario of SAP sales, sap buying, and the same thing could go for syrup buying, finished syrup sale or buying. Someone who has options can obviously navigate and find someone else to replace the source or the destination of where that product is going. Someone with limited options is going to have a little less leverage, and that's going to factor into who's possibly bearing the risk and who may want to take some steps to cover themselves. So as always here, this idea of leverage and consequences if something's not met, if it falls through. Little bit of legal background here, and I'm going to emphasize little again from an extension farm specialist or farm business specialist. There is this concept of a statute of frauds. It's been adopted over the centuries, really. Dates back over 100 years plus. Generally, most states have adopted some form of a statute of frauds, and I think this is really key. And what I understand is that the state's determination is going to help you understand when these legal agreements are binding and what criteria may need to be met for them to be binding. In general, and this comes up with the question of the handshake deal, and a handshake could be a perfectly legitimate contract between two parties, but the question is it legally binding and enforceable? A lot of the states will have a statute of frauds that says anything over $500 as a transaction does need to be in writing. And I don't want to say that that's in every state. But I want to encourage you to look further into that if it's related to you. This concept of over $500 may be a criteria in your locale. Statutes of frauds also and generally cover real estate sales. And if any of you have bought a home, you certainly have gone through the paperwork and signed things in triplicate and know that there's a large paper requirement there. Also, the concept of a contract that requires more than 1 year to fulfill. So as we go through the process of thinking maple sap, maple syrup, or anything else in the maple world, the duration of the contract going over 1 year could certainly indicate whether it does need to be in writing to be enforceable. Couple other things that I think are worth noting: the UCC, Universal Commercial Code, is a great reference. In general, a lot of definitions and terms and processes for business relationships, business transactions that are going to be referenced quite a bit, either in a formal legal agreement or in the background to get there. Something of note also, the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act, maybe not noteworthy in the sense that I looked it up. This is a pretty clear legal policy that was instituted to protect primarily fresh fruit and vegetable because of its perishable product, and it does provide certain protections in the sense that the buyers and the sellers need to be aware of the perishability and the fact that certain parties need to do certain things to make sure that that product can be attended to without it spoiling or going bad. I think this is highly related to maple sap, but this is an agreement that was basically set up for fresh vegetables and fruit, and a number of other specialty products have been identified as covered. And I found just in general research, maple sap is not covered. I don't know if that's something to pursue or not, but it's certainly a reference point for what could go wrong and is worth checking. So now let's get to the reality for you. Handshake deals, verbal agreements are commonplace, and we're not trying to diminish them at all. Let's take this as an educational venture of what we really need to discuss between the parties. And then at that point, really have the reckoning and saying, how much risk do you face and how much can you tolerate? Everyone on this call probably has a different level of risk tolerance, some from personality and some from just your position where your business is. Maybe it's more or less established. Again, back to credit and finance, how much risk can you bear without it being too painful? And it's a decision you're all going to have to make independently and with your business relationships, but that magnitude of risk is something that is going to be a factor here. And then back again to that risk sharing and risk shifting. If you're in a partnership or engaging in one where you feel like you want to balance it out, I've mentioned already the possibility there with contracts. So let's look at some essential elements of a contract here. A couple more boilerplates, and then we're gonna kind of flush through this concept of a SAP, sale and purchase agreement, and see if we've hit some of the considerations. So 5 essential elements of a contract. Number 1, all parties have the mental capacity to enter into the contract. I'm sure that could be disputed, and I'm sure it will be in the future, but the general essential element is there, that we want to know who we're dealing with and know that everyone's of sound mind to enter into it. Number 2, all parties have an idea of the nature or purpose of the contract. This is pretty basic from what I read, but if you're talking about selling sap, you need to specify we're talking about selling sap. We're not talking about selling syrup in a barrel. And so being specific so that both parties are firmly understanding what it is we're talking about here. And 3 more here. Number 3, so an offer to enter a contract must exist. Got to be clearly offered. And then number 4, there has to be a clear acceptance of an offer. And from what I understand, a clear acceptance does not mean there needs to be the absence of a deferral. There needs to be a clear acceptance of the contract. And then number 5, the contract, as we'll see in a little bit, will certainly have what they call consideration, a promise to do something and or the promise to exchange something needs to be specified in the relationship. So boilerplate, essentials to entering into a contract. Next, I'm going to look at 4 slightly different forms of contracts, very general, very satellite view here. Really, I think to provide an understanding that these can be done a couple different ways, and the ways that they're done do have some different implications. In a few minutes, we'll dive into the concept of a purchase and sales agreement, and we'll look at different features and elements that we've decided so far we think here at UVM are relevant. So I'm going to hold that one, but just know that this concept of a purchase and sale agreement, the idea of 2 parties saying, hey, we're going to do business, and here's the specifics of that business. We'll look at that in a minute. The second example here is a production contract. This is something that we probably, for better or worse, are familiar with hearing about poultry contracts, let's say. There is the potential to develop a binding contract, a binding agreement between two parties. And in the essence of a production contract, it's really notable that the producer may actually have no legal title to their crop. The agreement needs to be established in advance of the production process. But once that agreement is set in this form of contract, the crop's actually considered bailment. I don't know what that means, but I would say it's more of like the crop is in custody, but it's not so much owned by the producer because the contract is already established that the ownership really goes to the end buyer or the processor. I think this is actually quite common with grain elevators or situations where a commodity like a cereal grain or corn is shipped over and delivered to a location. It's held there, but it's not actually owned by the person that has the drying facility or the silo. It's still owned by the farmer. It's just transitioning through. So we've got a purchase and sale agreement separate from a production contract. A couple other here that may be on the fringes, but worth noting, the concept of an independent contractor. Well, I think we all hire independent contractors, whether they're formally set up in paperwork or not, could depend. But tubing installation is something we know is occurring quite readily around our industry. And there's other contract services that anyone might need for their business that's not specific to the syrup itself. I think a current or a specific point here for an independent contractor is this is where you can get into an agreement where the agreement may actually require performance of a special function or particular production method per se could be prescribed in an independent contractor relationship. Looking at something a little different here, a personal service contract, another flavor here for a relationship. And this is one that really focuses on the service. So an example that I think is possible here, looking less at the product output. So let's say less about a purchase and sale agreement that's specific to the volume of sap coming off a sugar bush and going to somebody else's tank. This could be a situation where perhaps a landowner has a sugar bush. The relationship isn't really set up on the provision of sap. It may be the provision of maintaining the woods or running the system. Borderline here, whether you've got an employee relationship or not, but I think there are definitely certain service contracts that could relate to forest management and stewardship that's not necessarily related to the transaction of, say, sap or syrup. So there's 4 very basic agreement formats, just I think to make people aware that your relationship may be different, and a different type of agreement may need to be set up. So now I think for the next few minutes here, we're going to look at really the draft of a maple sap purchase and sales agreement. I'm going to lay out some of the different features that from myself and conversations with a few sugar makers and some business specialists, what we think is relevant. And then at that point, I think maybe in 10 or 15 minutes, open it up for some real Q&A and some additions for sure. I also want to thank some of our colleagues down in West Virginia. A couple years ago, I actually got a basic template in West Virginia. They were already starting to look at binding contract templates for maple and other tree syrups. And so we took some of the information from them, and I think we're going to look to add to it with our template coming out of UVM. But thanks to those down in West Virginia that shared some of that foundational work. So what are we looking for? General goals here. Let's start general. Well, if I'm a sap seller, I'm looking for timely payment, whichever time we agree to, but timely payment. And if I'm a sap buyer, what am I looking for? I'm going to be looking for performance expectations to be met. And in a minute here, we'll dive more into those performance expectations. But in general, people want to get what they're supposed to get out of the agreement when they want it. I think I've got 7 or 8 key features here of a SAP purchase and sale agreement. I'll work through them in chunks and then we'll go into specifics. So we're going to want to make sure the agreement identifies the parties. Certainly always want legal entity names. We're going to need to define the product. Remember the essentials of a contract here. Make it clear. If we're talking about SAP, we're talking about SAP. I'll go through quickly and then we'll dive in more specifically. Contract type. We've got a couple different options for contract types that are worth considering. Contract duration, terms of renewal, and then the performance criteria. This is going to get into the specific of what that product needs to look like or what shape it needs to be in. What else do we want to see in this agreement? We want to have some specifics on price, either clearly stated or clear reference to where it would be found and where it might change or when it might change. Next, we're going to want to have different data requirements. If there's an inspection or receiving process, that needs to be built into the agreement. And then finally, terms of payment, and then this big bucket of legal details. Now, tonight, I'll be clear, I'm not an attorney, so I really can't get into the specifics of all the legal details. We could talk about them, but these are certainly essential. So tonight, what I'd like to do is go through in a little more specificity these 5 here, and then let's call out some questions we have or things we're not sure of, and we'll certainly attend to those in templates. But let's look at the ones we can talk most about and see where we go. So let's define the product first. Are we talking raw sap? Are we talking concentrate? These are things that are pretty basic but need to be spelled out. I think the concept of delivery, from what I understand, would be very well worth getting right on the front in the product exchange, but this could come up again in the details of the performance expectations. So define the product is generally, from what I've seen, and I've read a lot of winery and grape contracts in the past couple weeks. This section does not need to be very long, just needs to be really clear. What are we dealing with? What's the business at hand? The contract type, this is something to think about here, and I think this goes to the nature of who you are and kind of what the parties each need and what their options are. There is an option, and this is again common in the winery and grape industry, to have a coverage sales agreement for the whole acres, and in this case, the whole number of taps. In the winery world, it could say here's a particular acreage or a particular parcel, a particular subset of vines, but the assumption is the full production from the producer would be transferred to the buyer. That's one way the agreement could be established. Another way an agreement could be established would be based on volume. And I think what this lends itself to is the conversation or the potential that the processor could have capacity limitations at any point in the process. So it is common, and we've seen this in other industries, for a volume-based contract to stipulate that there's a certain number of, in this case, if we're saying sap, a certain number of gallons that could be delivered potentially in a day, potentially in a week. There's a potential cap on the amount of gallons that could be delivered over the season. And what I want to note here also is just kind of the boundaries on the season, because we've got, I know, sap producers in different regions have different capacity to produce sap. We've also got the processor consideration on where they're at in their season and at what point they decide that they're no longer in production of finished maple syrup. So those are 2 good considerations there, and I think you can think about them in different ways if you're a buyer or you're a seller, if you want to move the whole production, or if there needs to be some more specificity to make sure that that flow of goods is going to be timed right, especially with production capacity in a sugar house. So some performance criteria here. I'm going to give you a few here that are subjective, possibly qualitative, and then we'll look at some that are maybe a little bit more quantitative, which I think is really going to be a good source of conversation in a moment. So freshness. I think we all know that maple sap needs to be of the utmost freshness and the utmost quality. How that's evaluated and measured would need to be stipulated, would need to be clear between parties. Odors, cloudiness, sliminess, funkiness, buddiness. I think we've heard these terms thrown around. These are all things that need to be factored in. Contamination or the absence of contamination. Really important for us to think about how would we identify that and how would both parties agree. In a minute here, we'll get to the records section and the data preparation. But freshness has got to be super, super high on the list, and both parties need to understand what that means, and I think have a collective understanding of when it's not going to be met. Here's some measurables. I think we're clear that this is already happening. This is data collection that's happening between sap buyers and sellers. Possible temperature upon delivery could be relevant, especially if we're talking about concentrate. We know that this becomes more perishable as we start to concentrate into higher sugars, and especially if we start to transport things. As we know from the milk industry and cheesemakers, the idea of agitation certainly is a factor with milk. I'm not so sure if it's going to be a factor with sap, but temperature is on people's mind. Sugar content and bricks level is definitely a measurable that's going to factor into possibly performance criteria, or possibly when the buyer is no longer interested if the sap sugar content drops below a certain level. And of course, the volume of delivery. So how many gallons are delivered is going to be something that's easily measurable and something that's going to easily be tracked. So the next performance criteria, potentially, depending on what the relationship is for SAP, is who's going to manage delivery? Is this a situation where the buyer has the capacity and has the trucking to go around and collect SAP? Certainly could impact prices. Or is it a situation where the seller is responsible to get that SAP delivered? And I'm sure you've all heard it, and I've heard everything from delivering on behind tractors, delivering in formal trucks, and some adjacent landowners that have the capacity to pump and pump their sap over the hill or down the terrain to the buyer. So there's all going to be options here, and I think it could be specified and will certainly have an impact on possibly the pricing and how that part of the relationship goes. I think a couple notables here for delivery, pumping and tanks. I think you can all imagine the different bottlenecks, the potential of equipment working or not working, the potential of tank storage being there or being over full. And so these are factors that I'd encourage to be included. I've only got a few more slides here, so I just want to remind you, if you've got questions, feel free to type them into the chat. We'll go through them in a few minutes, and then we'll also probably be able to open up the mics for Q&A in a couple more slides here. So performance criteria delivery. Okay, data and inspection. So another basic to contracts and basic to business relationship is establishing a receiving procedure. Obviously establishing the paperwork that would be transferred upon receipt. So who would receive it? When is receiving time appropriate, inappropriate? What's the inspection process? And then definitely in any formal contract, there will be some clarity on how the rejection would be dealt out and what the timing of the rejection would be if the product, again, didn't meet the performance criteria. So these are really, now we get to the point of what if this situation is not working? The baseline contract hopefully has spelled out these steps so someone can understand, oh, if it's not going to meet the test, I'm going to know at this point, versus maybe weeks down the road and managing that part of the unfortunate situation. Some basic data and records, right? Proof of delivery, date and time. We mentioned bricks, we mentioned volume. Just a question, volume in the tank, volume via the meter. Is there any major loss via the pump process and the tubing process? I don't know if it's consequential or not, but something to think about. And again, that qualitative assessment, I'm not exactly sure how that's going to be done as a non-Maple specialist, just as a business person. So I'd love to get people's feedback when we talk about what are the ways that we can collectively understand the vocabulary for that qualitative assessment of freshness or the nature of the sap. So moving on from data and inspection, just now pricing and payment. Again, you could stipulate a price in a binding contract. You can also stipulate a reference point, which is fair. So on the right-hand side, you can see an example of a card that we produce at UVM here with a basic SAP price value based on sugar content and based on market price. So I think this is something that can be discussed. What is the market price reference? A couple different options out there. If you're not familiar, Cornell's been publishing SAP price tables for years. UVM, we've now got a couple posted, or one posted at maplemanager.org. I've also seen a few others online. So there are reference points that do the quantitative math between the market price, the sweetness of the sap, and then how much value in syrup there could be there. Generally, what we've seen in a sap sales agreement is regional in nature. Anywhere from 50% to 70% can go to the sap seller, and that's 50% of the final syrup value going through those calculations, and then deciding the percentage that goes to the sap seller. In more competitive maple regions like Northern Vermont, we certainly see 65%. Sometimes you hear 70% goes to the seller. I think that's a function of very specialized processing facilities where they really have their production costs and their variable costs are lower, and the input is going to be where they put their money. In other regions, definitely we see, and we've seen this from survey work, more 50% SAP share to the seller. Another factor here is grade and price. Remember, the SAP seller, once that SAP comes out, it goes out of your hands and goes into the hands of the processor. Now you're actually out of control of what the final grade of the syrup will be. In some cases, the grade will dictate the price, and that is a feature that I think is relevant in some agreements. If there's an ability to know in advance that the processor is going to be getting paid a different price for different grades of syrup, that may need to be featured into or factored into the pricing. And I understand that could be tough to predict given the nuances of syrup processing and also the factor of sap quality. But again, let's try to figure this out and discuss it with your parties ahead of time. So if a disagreement were to occur, we at least have some familiarity with what the thinking is. Okay, finally here for our specifics without getting into the real legalese here, timing. What are you looking for? Are you looking for cash on delivery? Can you realistically expect cash on delivery? If you're a sap seller, you're looking for payment at the end of the production season. And let's face it, if you're a processor, are you looking to pay someone right when you collected all the sap and made the syrup, or are you hoping to maybe have some leeway there and pay people for sap at some point later when that inventory is getting sold? These are things that are definitely worth considering, and whether it's sap or finished syrup, I think we need to understand the inventory lag time with the processor and the seller is potentially significant, and both parties are going to want to work that out well in advance and hopefully find some agreement. So I honestly could not get into the specifics tonight on some of those legal details of the breaches, and I will just say that when we get our templates more formalized, we're going to have a lot more information there. Doesn't mean we can't talk about it, but I'm going to stop there with some of the things that were at least within my wheelhouse. And at this point, really like to open it up for conversation. We can, in a second, unlock you so you can ask some questions out loud. And if you've got anything you'd prefer to type, definitely type into the chat box. I'm going to leave it to you. I think you can all think of a few things that could go wrong that I didn't mention. So if you've got some ideas of what could go wrong or what things you may want to protect yourself from, I'll wait and please chime in.
Everyone should be able to unmute at this point.
Great, thanks, Mark. So if you want to unmute yourself, you can do it. You just manually go up to the top ribbon, and hoping to see some questions and also just some conversation here, because it looks like almost half of you would like to get into some legal agreements.
While people are thinking about their questions, Mark, I'll just jump in. It was great. So things you just don't think about, especially with something as traditional as maple, where there's a long history of handshake deals, and one thing that I think the maple industry is a little behind in is the instrumentation for measuring, especially when you talk about like a sap purchase. There is not a established requirement for using a certified meter for measuring gallons of sap. A lot of people use something as inaccurate as how full is their 500 gallon poly tank that is a nominally 500 gallon tank. Some people will just eyeball it. Some people will use a flow meter, but they can have a pretty high error rate. So I think in a SAP only contract, it might be good to explicitly state how are you going to define how many gallons are changing hands. And the same goes for SAP concentration. In Vermont, SAP hydrometers are actually individually numbered. They are traceable to a standard that, assuming it went through the state of Vermont lab. It's not true for syrup hydrometers. So there's definitely some issues there with defining what the product being exchanged is. And it would probably be good to have that in a contract. All right. Anyone else have questions or comments? Oh, I see in the chat. Yeah, April, we've actually updated the Sugarbush lease. It's on maplemanager.org. I can actually put a link in the chat. Well, I did earlier for Maple Manager, but if you go there the first time, you might have to go through a very minor survey. It's like take you a minute to do, and then you'll be able to have access to that new updated Sugarbush lease, as well as the guide to kind of explain the parts.
Perfect. I think that if I can make a comment, I would really like to comment on something that has impacted us in a big way, and it's something that you don't ever expect. It's without having these legal agreements in place, if there is a death in the family, it's it's ridiculously hard to fix things. So the more agreements that there are that are in place for any landowner, whether you're young or old, I can only encourage people to do it so that they don't end up in court for as long as we've been there.
Yeah, April, I appreciate you making that comment, and my heart goes out to you because it sounds like it's from personal experience. And I think that is the difficult reality of obviously doing a program like this and thinking about this, is that we certainly hope that things go well and that no one has any problems. And 8 out of 10 times in relationships, things can go well, but it's those 2 out of 10 when something goes wrong, and often very unexpected. It's very helpful and often necessary to have something to refer to and say, this is how we deal with it. And I don't actually, going back to the lease, you mentioned the old version from UVM Extension and Larry Mayotte. I have to relook at that to see what we added, but I could tell you, I'm pretty sure we added quite a bit to the lease template, and we also annotated some different features. And the a common feature in a lease agreement would be the assignment to heirs. And if, boilerplate legal document would spell out and should be discussed, how the relationship transfers if a certain member passes away, if there's a divorce, if there's a disability. Tough situation, tough enough already to be in those situations, and even more difficult to have court dealings to resolve them.
I would not encourage anybody to alter these boilerplates and consider them gospel until they have been gone over by an attorney. Because there's too many things that people can change. One single word, it doesn't seem that important, can change everything.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, good reminder, and we try to indicate that these are educational resources, and like we said, we're getting you to think about these things, but you've got everyone on this call, anyone that pulls these templates has their own legwork to do to not just get them completed, but to understand really what it means. Thanks, April. Mark, you mentioned instrumentation, which is great. I mean, who else has situations? Feel free, if you maybe share in the chat box something that hasn't happened to you or something that you could consider going wrong for somebody else. We'd certainly appreciate it, because we're going to be working with attorneys to draft new templates. And as always, the templates we've seen from 10 or 15 years ago, they just don't feel like they've got enough guts in them. So we want to step them up and make sure people can see the different features. I can fill the air. Well, certainly chime in if someone wants to say anything. But if you're typing, one thing I'll note from looking at the contract law and contract guidance, when you get into the idea of a breach of contract, I think it's good to recognize that there really isn't an intention for the contract to penalize the person that didn't deliver, the person that left the agreement unfulfilled. So it's not necessarily to create a consequence or a penalty, but it's often the essence is to make the person who was injured whole again. So if in a case where there's a syrup processor that did not receive all the sap they were hoping to get, we're not going to penalize the sap producer to show them they did something wrong, but there is a process ideally to look to see what was missed by the syrup processor by not receiving that input, and then putting the magnitude on that to make them whole again. So I guess just a way to think about it is not to be adversarial or a slap on the wrist. It's really to make sure the person that again has the risk can find a way to bring themselves to whole.
Mark, we focused mostly on talking about SAP purchases, and April brought up the idea of a Sugarbush lease. And you did have a point about tubing installers. There are definitely plenty of stories of people hiring someone to do an installation with essentially a guess of what the tap count's going to be. And no one's going to go and do 100% survey of how many tappable trees and then do the installation. So it's going to be an estimate. But I could see room in a contract so that you're within some reasonable amount of the estimate. And so it's not way under, way over. And even which trees are getting taps.
Yeah.
Being really, really clear about what that minimum size is, not only from a production standpoint, because it's such a linear relationship between tree size and yield. You don't want to pay for 20,000 taps, but only functionally have 10,000 taps worth of conductive wood that's being tapped into. But also just, if you're in an agreement like a current use in Vermont or some other tax abatement program or certified organic, where you're legally bound to a standard of a minimum tapping, you want to make sure you're not paying for something that is going to put you at risk of violating that agreement.
Yeah, agreed. And you hit the forestry side. I was also thinking about just other regulations, and you all probably know your domains well enough to know if you have water quality situations like we do in Vermont, potentially wetlands or protected land features that could be impacted by something like a tubing installation. Then we get into the sticky situation of who's liable. Is the landowner liable, or is it the installer that's liable? Certainly no one wants to go there, but it's good to lay that type of worst case scenario out ahead of time.
Has there been any change in the new contract from the old one that Larry Maya put together to the new one that you guys are working on that addresses waste and tubing garbage and that kind of stuff being left in the woods?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if that was covered in the prior Sugar Bush lease, but I do know that we annotated that. Mark, you can chime in here. I'm pretty clear that we annotated. I don't know if we provided boilerplate language, but we certainly talked a lot about that feature of cleanup and disposal in our conversations. Pretty sure it's in there. Looks like Mark's scanning.
Yeah, I'm just going to try to look at it. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I believe there is some sort of performance about not leaving debris, but I'd have to look back and make sure.
Yeah, it's a great point.
And April, that's a really good point, because by some estimates, taking tubing out and disposing of it either in the landfill, or if you're lucky enough to be near where tubing is able to be recycled, that can cost almost as much as the installation in the first place. So it's not an insignificant cost taking tubing out.
Even just the drops being left on the ground and just general trash being left there by people working in the woods and that kind of thing. If you're a landowner, it's something that should be addressed in a contract like that, what the expectation is. The other major suggestion that I have is it's very helpful if you do accomplish one of these agreements and they're signed, to file them with the town clerk. They should be filed with the town clerk anyway, but if something bad happens, having these lease agreements so that everybody understands what the transition is it's extremely important.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
April, I was able to find the language we have. So it's the one thing I can tell you is it's much longer. So the new Sugar Bush lease agreement was 12 pages, and we do have a segment. It's in section 5 that says the leasee shall keep the ground free of scrap, tubing, wire, or other trash throughout the lease period, and shall set no fires upon the premises. And there's also a section about complying with federal, state, and local laws, regulations, and ordinances, which references the use value appraisal program in Vermont, wetlands rules, that sort of thing. And you might, if you're in a different state, you would probably want to swap out your state or municipal regulations there.
All right, I got a question in the chat there. Is there a link to the sample contract? And just to be clear, we're kind of talking about a couple different project, well, a couple different legal documents. We can put the link back in for the Sugar Bush lease, and we also have a Sugar House. I believe it's a lease. I can't remember if it's a license. We've got 2 agreements that are already published online for Sugar Bush and Sugar House, and then these templates for binding contracts, which would be a SAP purchase and sale agreement, has not been developed yet. So that will go to maplemanager.org probably December, maybe January at the latest, and then we'll also be looking at a syrup purchase and sale contract template as well. So those are not yet posted.
So I just dropped a link to the Sugar Bush lease. That's the
Great.
one with annotations.
Have any more questions or comments before we wrap up tonight? Okay. Oh, I'm reading that one. I'll read it out loud. Good question here. Are there any state laws that would ensure that the landowner would not be responsible for cleaning up the sugaring operation if the operation ceases? I am not exactly sure what the state laws are, but this is, well, just make a segue here. We've been working on contracts for water quality in relation to Vermont water quality standards on livestock farms and hayfields. And this is something I'd have to look up from our drafts there, but we did go down this road of liability and indemnification of who is going to end up, especially if there's a breach of state law, who would be responsible. I could probably, I might be able to find that link in a second here. It's not specific to maple. So I'm going to find that. Mark, do you have any comments on the cleaning, if there's any state regulations? I'm going to guess no. I think it's going to be a unfortunate situation for the landowner, and then potentially a liability if the property were to transition, not necessarily breaking the law, but a potential liability on the property value if there's a whole bunch of garbage there, without a doubt.
I think that you would be talking about a civil suit in that event.
Mm-hmm.
If there was stuff left there, the only option would be more likely than not a civil suit against the renter for the expenses of getting rid of it, but you would still have to deal with getting rid of it. They wouldn't come back and do that. If you guys want any input on things that could go wrong, I'm your girl.
All right, awesome. April, if that's you, if you could email, my email is listed all over our literature. If you could email me, we'd love to get your input because we're going to be drafting templates and going through that. You know, I like to call it the pre-mortem, unfortunately. You know, what could go wrong? Let's figure it out before it happens, and then factor that in.
Hey, if I could save somebody else boatloads of money, I'm in.
That's great. I'm sorry you're in a position to share that much knowledge, but we're certainly in a position to help spread the word. So we really appreciate
it's a
that.
learning experience, and
Yeah.
you know, like I said, it's literally irresponsible for a landowner with a business like that, especially in the business of maple, in the business of any agriculture. It's literally irresponsible not to have some kind of a plan, and to have things put into legal terms, because if they're not there, the aggravation that it causes is it's irreparable damage.
I'll just chime in here back to John. You had a question. I'm not finding that, but I do have some documentation on that, potentially that situation as relates to water quality. If you want to send me an email, I'd be glad to send you it. It'd probably just take me 10 minutes to find that old slide and old document. So I'm just going to put my email in the chat box and send me a note, and I can get back to you probably before bedtime on that.
And
well,
that,
folks,
I think we're 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining us tonight. Like I said, we're going to be working on this project, and we will have sample templates forthcoming later on this winter. talked a little bit about the Sugar Bush and Sugar House leases. Those are available as well. We are going to have some lawyers working with us, so there is an Ask the Team function on that website. If you do have a specific question you didn't want to ask tonight, it can come into us confidentially through that Ask the Team module on the maplemanager.org website. And if we get any good ones there, I think we've got some legal services that we can tap into to at least get try to get you an answer that's better than it depends. Hopefully we'll get you something a little more specific than that. So feel free to use that. So with that, I hope you all have a good evening. Check out 2 more webinars later in October here before we wrap up our series. Thanks a lot for coming.
Good night, everyone.